for joining us for the digital panel discussion, Getting It Done, Tips and Tricks for Successful Dissertation Completion. This is a panel of professors and recent PhD grads sharing insights into successful strategies for preparing and defending and completing your dissertation. The Canadian Sociological Association Student Concerns Subcommittee wishes to situate its presence and the uninvited guests on the traditional territories of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across so-called Canada. This acknowledgement recognizes the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous nations and other territories that the CSA and its constituents work to live on. As a committee and organization, we strive to understand our role within Canada's ongoing settler colonial project that subjects Indigenous peoples to dispossession and genocide. We recognize our participation and complacency in colonial modalities and knowledge systems and are committed to decolonial praxis that center and affirm the contributions of Indigenous elders and scholars to the field of sociology. So before we all get started into this very exciting panel discussion, just some information about how you can be involved. So I should let everyone know that the audience members are muted to limit background noise in this discussion. If you have any questions during the panel, we encourage you to submit those through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be visible to all attendees and panelists and audience members. You can also upvote questions to prioritize them, and panelists will address your questions during the open Q&A period, which will be during the last 30 minutes of this discussion. So, who are we talking with today? Well, I'll be hosting today's discussion. I am Nicole Malette, and I am the Western Rep and Chair for the Student Concerns Subcommittee until June. In June, we have another great group of students who will be taking over in these positions, and you can learn more about members of the Students Concerns Subcommittee on our website, and you can learn more in June about the new incoming students who will be taking our positions.
Nicole, may I just, sorry, your slides aren't moving forward, so could you just move us to a new slide?
Oh no,
There we go, perfect, thank you so much.
Have they gone forward now?
They are now forward, thank you.
Great, okay. And so today we are very fortunate to be joined by a number of great panelists and professors from across the country. So our first speaker or panelist today is Dr. Jessica Braimoh from York University. Dr. Braimoh is an assistant professor at York University. Braimoh is a critical sociologist whose research and teaching interests lie in the interrelation between criminalization, racialization, class, and there's a lot going on my screen right now.
So the slides aren't moving forward again. So they did once, so just move it to the next slide. Perfect, got it.
Is that showing a full screen for you?
It is not full screen, but we can still see it. So I think it's still good.
Is that full screen?
No, it's not full screen.
Wow.
The way to make it full screen, I think, is to select to share your whole desktop and then make it full screen.
Okay. Hold on, everyone, just mild technical things. So
share your whole desktop.
And then
make it full screen.
Do we have, yes, thank you, Catherine. Okay, thanks everyone, okay. So let's do this again. Dr. Braimoh is a critical sociologist whose research and teaching interests include the interrelation between criminalization, racialization, and class, among other systems of domination and difference, socio-legal processes, and organizing institutions like education and social welfare, and the experiences of at-risk populations. Guided by principles of social justice, her work seeks to uncover the ways that inequality is perpetuated and maintained. Our next panelist is Dr. Corrigall-Brown, who is Associate Professor and incoming Chair of the Sociology Department at University of British Columbia. Her research focuses on participation in social movements, coalitions, funding, and framing. This research has appeared in Social Forces, Social Perspectives, the International Journal of Comparative Sociology, and she is also the author of Keeping the March Alive, How Grassroots Activism Survived the Trump's America, by New York University Press, and Social Movements by Stanford University Press. And lastly, we're joined by Dr. Casey Scheibling at McMaster University. Dr. Scheibling is a postdoctoral fellow in sociology at the University of Toronto and an adjunct faculty member in sociology at McMaster University. His research focuses on the interrelationship of fatherhood, masculinity, and men's health. As a recent recipient of a short postdoctoral fellowship and insight development grant, he is currently examining how gender expectations, work and family roles affect the mental health of new fathers. His publications can be found in journals such as the Canadian Review of Sociology, the Journal of Marriage and Family, Men and Masculinities, Sex Roles, and Symbolic Interaction. So thank you everyone for joining and taking time out of your very busy weeks. We greatly appreciate it. So without too much hesitation, I'd like to go into how each of you approach completing a dissertation. And I know that all of you have had the ability to work with grad students and our amazing supportive mentors. So can you all give me a brief description, and I know this is maybe challenging, a brief description of how your final dissertation defense went? And I'll start with Catherine.
Oh, that's a great, fun first question. So I will say that my final dissertation defense, the way that it was done at the university where I was it was just me in a room with my 3 advisors, and that was it. And I will say it felt a bit anticlimactic. You work on something for so long and you're so excited about the excitement of it being done. And then it was just the 3 of us in this room. And I think that what I've learned from that experience over time is that actually the dissertation defense should be a wonderful celebration of all of the amazing work that you've done. And actually now, when I go to dissertation defenses, I think that there is no better feel-good experience than being at someone's dissertation defense because they've been working on it for so long. And then this is the culmination of all their amazing work. And so I would say my own kind of lackluster experience of the dissertation defense has informed the way that I think that they should be done and my experience of defenses since then.
Thank you, that's fantastic. Jessica, would you like to tell us about how your defense went?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So maybe a little bit different than Catherine's experience. So I had my committee there. So there was 3 committee members. The external actually had to phone in. So there was some technical, maybe it would be different now if we did it. Maybe it'd be by Zoom. I don't think Zoom, maybe Zoom existed. I don't know. But it was by phone, a teleconference. So that was really interesting to not be able to see this person who had all this really great feedback and was asking all these really great questions. And then it was an open defense. So my defense, there were, I think there was at least 15 folks from the department who came. So other students, other faculty members, my partner. I did not allow my parents to come because I did not know how that would roll down. So they were not invited. But there was lots of people there, and it was both an opportunity, I think, as Catherine mentioned, to kind of celebrate this moment, but also very nerve-wracking because there were so many folks in the room.
Casey, how about you? How did your defense go?
It went really well, and it's something that I've come to value in looking back at it. And my thinking in saying that is it's kind of a very rare opportunity to have an in-depth discussion and introspective analysis of the work that you did with people who have actually gone through it with a very fine-tooth comb. And so it's, I struggle to think of many other cases that will occur later on in your career to that degree where, 3 or 4 people in that room have all looked through and unpacked the work that you've done over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And I think approaching the defense in that way can be really constructive for both how you model what you're going to talk about, and also using that time to engage with these scholars who are who have like an intimate understanding of the work that you've actually done. So that was really valuable. In terms of the structure of my defense, I had it in person in 2019 with my 3 committee members, and the external member was actually able to come in person, which was really nice. Most of my colleagues had the phone-in external like Jessica's, and so I was really happy that there was the external there. And I had a few of my colleagues come as well, mainly just for support. And for those reasons, it wasn't overly nerve-wracking for me or intimidating in terms of the audience. And I tried to position myself and the discussion around using this for really in-depth and constructive dialogue about my work.
I think this is a really good point that each of you share, is that there are very few times in your academic career that you're going to have the opportunity to just, I don't want to say talk ad nauseum about your work, but that you're going to have the ability to have the floor for a long period of time and have people who are engaged in your work in a really meaningful way. We see the dissertation defense as this really big, scary obstacle at the end of all your years of work. And looking back, it really should be a celebration. You should be looking forward to this, because if you've gotten to this point, you've gotten to this point. You did the work. It's time to celebrate it. But maybe there's some things that can help you get there so that you can be in a celebratory mood. So let's talk about those types of things. So what are the biggest obstacles students experience when preparing for their final dissertation defense? So I will give that one to Jessica first, if that's okay.
For sure. I think some of the greatest obstacles in terms of my own experience and having attended other defenses, I think is that you do really feel like you're going to be like grilled in terms of, you know, the work that you've done. And it's I think sometimes folks have a different interpretation of the types of questions that are being asked. It's not to put the spotlight on you, but to actually do what Casey has mentioned, to engage you in conversation about your work. And so I think sometimes, I know personally that I came across as defense, like in defense of like how dare you ask me that question? Like, you know, exactly, like, how dare you ask me that? And it wasn't meant to be that way. It was really an opportunity to have a conversation about the material. And I think it was a moment of the shifting gear of like, you're no longer a student anymore, right? Like you're shifting into this other space where we can have these productive, generative conversations about your work. And I think that reflecting on that experience, it was, how do I navigate that? How do I shift into that space? Because it's not often that you do have this opportunity to engage in conversations with other scholars on your work. So I think that's one of the biggest ones personally for me.
I think that's a really good point. And maybe it's just even speaks to the fact that we call it a defense, that you think that you're going into battle and you need to defend your points. And maybe you do. I have seen defenses that have become a little hairy that way, but that's not usually the case. And so a defending yourself situation maybe is not the mindset that we should go into it with. Casey, what do you think?
I'll start by just building on that, actually, in thinking that a possible obstacle is maybe feeling like you shouldn't defend some of the choices that you made, where this is really the opportunity and platform for you to do that. And, you know, there are possibilities where you could have, well, ideally not a committee member, but possibly an external member push back against your decision to do, say, I don't know, ethnography over survey data analysis and these sorts of things. And perhaps a cognitive obstacle is thinking that you don't have the confidence or the justification to say, no, I chose to do this. That's a different study, or that method doesn't align with the research question that I was asking. And so maybe not viewing it or not viewing opportunities to actually defend your choices could be somewhat of an obstacle. I think that another obstacle that comes to mind is just thinking that you have to cover everything, because that's not going to be the case, right? So going into the defense with the mindset of needing to remember everything that you did throughout your dissertation, either through your experience in the research, through writing, I think that that could end up being a really big mental hurdle that ultimately doesn't come to fruition, and you don't have to jump over it anyways. So focusing less on what you already did in the dissertation and thinking more about the knowledge that it's generated and the types of new avenues for research it's produced, which is, I have additional thoughts and tips about that as well that we can bring up after.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Catherine, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with both the other panelists. I think that, there's the sort of defensive side. So you don't want to be defensive, but on the other side, there's the sort of, I have no perspective, whatever you say is right? So the professor says, you should have done ethnography, and you say, yes, I should have done ethnography, right? So you don't want to be defensive, but you don't want to have no perspective at all. And I think actually in my own defense, it was a very hard question. And I was so trying to understand, like, well, do you mean that I should have done this or I should have done this? I was being so open and flexible, and I should have said, that's a very interesting perspective. I did this because of these 5 reasons. Because it turns out secretly, there isn't often a right answer. There's often multiple ways you could have done something. And all people are looking for is for you to say, consider what the comment is, reflect on it, and engage with it. Say, this is interesting. I could have framed it with this literature. This makes sense for this reason. I chose to do it this way for these reasons. And almost no one's going to say, well, that's wrong, because there's very rarely, like your committee wouldn't have let you get here if you did something bananas, right? There's very rarely a right answer. And I guess I would just also say that, remember that you're the expert. I didn't feel like I was the expert. I thought, well, everyone, all the professors in this room, they've been studying, I study social movements. They've been studying social movements forever. But you know what they hadn't been studying? My social movements. They hadn't talked to my people. They didn't know anything about my data, right? And I don't think I had the confidence to say, and now that I am the professor, I'll ask a question about like social movement theory generally. But if they say, well, yes, that theory is very interesting, but when I talk to my people or in my survey, blah, blah, this happened, etc., then it's like, well, you're the expert on that, right? And I think that you need to, it's very difficult, and it's taken me many a year to have this thought, but you need to just remember that you are the expert on your dissertation.
It's a really good point. And I think that you all bring up some really key challenges that, I've dealt with when I was preparing for mine, but also saw a lot of my peers dealing with this sort of feeling of, oh no, I have to defend myself, or, oh no, like, if somebody asks me a sticky question, like, how do I stand up for myself in those situations? What are some tips that you can think of for overcoming some of those challenges? Catherine, I liked you started to break down how you should respond to questions. There was 3 things that you just mentioned.
Yeah, so I think that, I always think about this about the job when I see people come for job interviews, and it's the same thing, right? You're going to get some sort of questions that are reasonable and then like some bananas questions, right? So I always feel like the first thing you want to do is really show that you're considering what they're saying. So sometimes that just involves writing it down, right? So it's like, that was interesting enough that I'm now writing this down and engaging and thinking about it. It also gives you a second to like process your thoughts. Then I think you want to really reflect on what is that question about, right? Is it that you think I should have engaged with a different literature or a method or this or that? And then you just want to sort of engage with that question. And so you could say, this is the, this is why that would be interesting, but I chose to do this and this is why. So as long as people feel that you're considering their question, you're reflecting on what it means, and you're engaging with that, most people don't think that there's like, the answer isn't 4 or something that they're trying to wait for you to get. All they want you to do is to say, I can engage with that, and I have something useful to say as a result.
That's really good. Jessica, do you have anything to add? Any tips?
I think the one thing I would add, because I 100% agree with everything that Catherine mentioned there, is that it's okay to ask for clarification on a question. if you're trying to mull it over, you've written it down, you think you understand what the question is, it's okay to say, can you rephrase that for me? Or I'm not sure, is this what you're trying to ask me to think about? Did I answer your question? Because I think that does show that you are trying to engage and that you are listening, because we all just want to be heard. So that would be the only thing that I would add, is that it is totally okay to say, I don't quite understand. There were times I know in my dissertation, or my defense rather, where I feel like, I don't know, maybe I went somewhere else and I just wasn't hearing. And then I came back and I was like, oh, someone was asking me a question. Can you please rephrase that? Because I did not, I was in La La Land. And then you take a moment and you write it down. Happens all the time, happened to lots of folks that I saw do their defense. So it's perfectly okay to ask for that person to reiterate or to repeat the question.
Can I just add to Jessica? So I 100% agree with you. And sometimes you end up answering like some bananas question they didn't even mean. So it's better to do that. But that's also why the writing down is good, because it's also okay to take a second. You don't get extra bonus points for speed. So it's okay just to say, like, humans need to process information. So if you just want to say, like, let me just think about that, you take a few seconds, that's just normal, and don't feel bad, right? No one's timing you on your answer.
Which is exactly how I felt in my defense of, like, the second the person finished the question, I needed to have an answer. And then as we kind of went through the rounds, because there was multiple rounds, I realized, like, we can all take a break. Other people need a break too. Like, people are having a sip of water, a drink of their coffee, which is maybe something that you strategically do. I do that when I teach. I bring my water with me. If there's a pause of, like, let's give people a moment to think about this, you do that for yourself too. So that's also a good way to kind of check yourself.
I like that. And I also like that it is essentially giving yourself space and taking your time for yourself in your defense, like bringing it back that you're the one that's in charge, you're the one that's giving the responses. So let's just take it back to yourself. Casey, do you have any tips that you'd like to add on to those?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything that Catherine and Jessica are saying, with potentially adding almost trying to resist the urge to treat the defense like a typical conference presentation, where you do feel like, you know, you have to provide these immediate answers to the questions that are posed. And also to that end, trying to forget, like, using a script. I don't mean in a literal sense, but just try to ditch, like, what you're expecting to have to talk about and actually just listen to what people are asking you, because it may end up being, you know, less related to the theory or methods or findings of your dissertation and more about the practical contribution it makes to society. And, you know, you might stumble over those questions if you're trying to think of what's going to be asked next at the expense of really listening to what people are asking you. And I think this might foreshadow another question that Nicole raises, but ideally the supervisor or chair in this situation can you know, try to break down some of the, like, conference formalities that could have been integrated into the defense that, you know, can exacerbate fear and anxiety around asking questions, and likewise come at the expense of, you know, really engaging in deep conversation with other intellectuals, which in my opinion is what it should be more than anything else.
That's a really good point, and I think it feeds back to our earlier conversation about the defense is yours and an opportunity to delve deep into your own research. And if you're coming back with scripted responses and that kind of attitude to everything, you're not going to have that opportunity to delve deeper into the work and really consider other perspectives. So it's almost shooting yourself in the foot to do that. You really want to have this opportunity where you are getting to engage in fun conversations with each other about this topic that you love, that you've been studying for so long. So you all have been talking about your own defenses, but I know that you've all had the opportunity to witness other people's defenses and maybe even have had the opportunity to sit on some committees where an individual has defended. From your experience, what makes a great defense? And I'll start with Catherine.
Yeah, so as I said before, there's literally no more feel-good experience ever than sitting on a defense of a student who's been working really hard for a long time. So it's wonderful. I would say, honestly, I feel like all students do really well. They're nervous because they're normal humans, and I was nervous, and they get tired because they're very long. So you should pace yourself. But I think in general, students just do amazingly well because they know their work so well. I will say one place that I think that it's a bit different between a really amazing defense and just a good defense is in the sort of length of responses people give. So I think that sometimes what happens when we are all naturally nervous is we end up giving outlandishly long responses to things because we're like, you know, your questions about the methods in chapter 3, let me tie it to the methods in every other chapter, and then like so some theory thing into this and that, and you're sort of like, you're trying to cover everything. The defenses that I've been at that I really thought, oh, that person really hit it out of the park are the ones where they sort of, they take the question, they have a reasonable answer to it, and then they just leave it. And if the person wants more, then they'll follow up and say, well, can you compare it to this or that, or can you do this or that? But I think sometimes when we're nervous, naturally, we try to fill in like all the details in the world. And I think if you can hold yourself back from that, answer the question, and then just leave it and allow the person to follow if they want to. And they probably don't, and they're going to move on to something else.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I like that a lot. Casey, do you have anything to add? Any defenses that you saw that were good?
Yeah, I'll admit I haven't been to too many. I'm a postdoctoral fellow, so I graduated in 2019 in the fall. But I have seen a couple others and can think of some things that make a great defense beyond what Catherine is saying. One of them is a bit more practical and also contingent, but just whether you have a supportive external person on the committee can really make a big difference. And there is some background work that may vary by institution, I'm not sure, that you can do as a student in conjunction with your supervisor to, you know, help to ensure that you have an external evaluator who's going to be supportive, and, you know, even if they're critical of your work or push you to clarify and fix things, that they're ultimately going to be supportive of the end product whenever the end is. And also there can be some contingency around who sits in on as the chair, who could be from someone within the university who, you know, and I think that students should know these things, that it could be someone who will just ask you questions out of left field that are totally inappropriate, right? And you can know that you can take that as a grain of salt with them just being the chair from another department who is just signing documents. So maybe I'm answering this question by saying what makes a non-great dissertation, but I think that, you know, things like that can shape a good dissertation defense into one that's great if everyone in the room is on board, basically.
I think that's a good point. And I also think that that kind of speaks to a student's response too. There's probably a good chance that you will have, as Catherine says, some banana questions that come your way when you're in your defense. And you just, like you said, take them with a grain of salt and you keep going with it. You keep rolling with the punches. Don't let it bog you down. Jessica, what tips do you provide for students? Or what have you seen as great defenses?
Yeah, I think the ones that I've seen that have been really good are ones where when the student presents the material, they're not rehashing the entire defense, or the entire dissertation rather. They're really just hitting on the kind of key points, the key takeaways, the contributions. They are really opening up a conversation for dialogue on the material. Ones where, you know, the student tends to go through every seemingly nitty-gritty detail, have not been as successful in the ones that I've seen. Because again, the assumption is that folks who are sitting at that table have read the work, right? And so it's about having conversation about, so why does this matter? Why did we do these things? What does this mean for future work? Those have been I would say the stronger defenses.
a good point. And it's important for students to know to keeping themselves sort of in check. I think like Catherine says, when you get nervous, you want to throw the book out there, you want to throw all of your knowledge. But it almost speaks more or louder volumes when you do give a point and can stand back from it and stand against that point. So all of you in some regard in your questions or your responses have made comment about the committee. So how can supervisors best support students coming into their defenses? Jessica, would you like to start off with this one?
For sure. So one of the things that I was able to do with my supervisor was to kind of have some meetings leading up to the defense to talk about the chapters that I was least comfortable with, the theories that we had drawn upon that, again, like many years ago, you know, you'd done a detailed read of, and we need to come back to. And what we did was actually have like practice questions that we actually verbalized out loud to one another, so that I could have some practice in actually having someone ask me a question and then trying to respond to it. Because, and I'm sure others would agree, so much of the dissertation writing happens in your head, happens by yourself. And so you don't often get an opportunity to have a more formal conversation with folks about that work. So kind of taking a step back once it was seemingly all said and done, to have those conversations in a very structured way was really helpful to me.
Excellent. Catherine, do you have any insight that you can pass along on this as well?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Jessica, and practicing also for many places here, at least, you have to do a little presentation at the beginning. So like practice that presentation so you know how long it is. It's not like 45 minutes and it's not 5 minutes, right? And see how it kind of lands. So that's really smart, and practicing questions, exactly as Jessica said. But also I want to circle back to something Casey said that I totally agree with, is when you're thinking about your university examiners or whatever you call it, right? So you got your committee, you're already nailed into that, right? But then the other people who are going to come, and it's not that you want someone easy who's just going to say like everything's fine, but you want someone who's not a bozo. And so what I would say is find someone that your advisor has met in the real world, not just someone whose article is interesting, because lots of people's articles are interesting and they are actually kind of bozos, right? Or they write articles that, you know, that are not related, but they give a super helpful comment. So you want someone that someone has actually met in the real world and knows is going to be like, is this person coming to the table wanting to make this better? Or is this person coming to the table so that they can show off their fancy knowledge of X, right? And you don't want that person in the room. That person's not going to give you, you're not getting anything out of it. And it's just going to make for a negative experience. And it's the same thing about the chair. In many places, the chair is from somewhere else. You want a chair that your advisor has met in the real world and knows is a reasonable person and isn't going to ask you some crazy question about whatever. And if it happens, you engage with the question and you just move on. But why not control that by picking someone who's going to be reasonable in the room? So I think that like meeting a person in the real world before they're on the committee is a critical part of that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that those are some good points that you can bring along to your supervisor before you're defending, that I don't think a supervisor would have any issue with if you're just like, I know that I can't meet my external and I know that I can't know who my external is, but if you think that the external is a fantastic researcher who also is a decent human to work with, that would be fantastic. And also, Jessica, you're pointing out that having some practice questions are really useful. I don't know how many other departments do it, but at UBC, I did 2 defenses. We did our in-department defense and then we did our university defense. And I know that some universities, we don't have 2. And I'm really thankful for that in-house defense because it was a lovely opportunity to do my presentation and work out some of the questions or just get to see what some of the questions were before we went to the university-wide defense. This might not be for everyone, but I also did defenses for friends and then did defenses for a family group. And so if you want bananas questions and practice like going through bananas questions, do it with friends and family members. You cannot anticipate what's coming down the line with them. And it's a really good way to like keep your cool. Casey, have you seen any and would like to pass along some ideas of what supervisors can do to help support?
Yeah, I mean, I was mainly going to expand on my earlier comment, but Catherine already took care of that. But yeah, you like, and there's a question in the Q&A that speaks to it as well. So I'll just talk about it now. But you can start to, leading up to the defense, you can try to sleuth out, who is an expert in my area and also someone who is easy to work with or constructive. And, because it may not necessarily be both. And so, like Catherine is saying, ideally, it'll be someone else in your committee knows or has met, or someone in the department would vouch for. And you can start to talk to people about that, about your thoughts. And like Nicole says, there is policies around not knowing who your external is going to be, but you're allowed to make like suggestions about who you think would be a good fit in that role. And that's what I did, and it turned out well. And I think too, building off of what Jessica was talking about, was I think what I also did was had a meeting with my supervisor, and he asked about the type of questions that I would be most capable of answering as a way to sort of like get the first question, or at least from your supervisor in the first round, to be not necessarily easy, but something that you want to talk about. And that's what he did. So for his first question of my defense, it was one that I knew was coming, basically. And it allowed me to sort of feel at ease, and it's still answering a question that is, relevant and important to my dissertation. And then later on, it would be more, emergent questions that occur during the rounds of the defense. But I think something like that can be really helpful for a supervisor to do, and sort of break the defensive ice, so to speak, and to, allow yourself as the student to feel a bit more at ease, while still engaging with the stuff that you need to talk about in your dissertation.
And I think that this is a really good point. And I think that it also, a lot of students going into a defense, be it a comprehensive exam or a final PhD defense, we're unaware, or we are afraid of sort of transgressing any rules around the procedure. And there are ways that you can advocate for yourself, or you can ask for things that are reasonable. You can ask your supervisor to help you out with some of these questions, maybe review them before you go in, or even, like you're saying, Casey, give you sort of a question that is more in line with what you want to respond to. You can ask these things. Maybe your supervisor doesn't do it, but there's nothing saying that you can't ask for this, that you can't advocate for yourself in this way. Then you may as well. So this sort of speaks to the next question that I want to broach with you all, which is, how can students socially, mentally, and physically prepare themselves for going into the defense? I know that I did not sleep very much the week going into a defense, and I ran a lot. So what are different things that students can maybe do? And coming from the other side, we can tell students this is how you can take care of yourself, either socially, mentally, or physically going into this kind of space. So I'll start with you, Casey.
Yeah, I mean, besides the the typical things like trying to sleep properly, which probably won't happen, and trying to eat well beforehand, taking water to the defense, all of those stuff that might be obvious. The only other thing that I could think of is, planning something fun to do afterwards, which may not be like immediately afterwards, but have something to look forward to after the dissertation defense is done, and use that for motivation. And I think that will link to your own psychological well-being going into it, unless something like that would put more pressure on you, like different strokes for different folks. But I think that having something to look forward to, the weekend of or next week, is a good motivational tool to keep you engaged in the dissertation, and a way to prepare yourself that isn't content driven, that's more like, I don't know, holistic fulfillment to encounter afterwards.
As you said, think of something to do afterwards, which I completely agree with. I had a get together with friends after mine because I was a remote defense, and was a couple months after the first lockdown. So nobody else got to be audience even. But we were going to this event that was outside, and on the way I was all ready and my husband decided we're going to go to Home Depot. So right after my defense, we went to Home Depot for an hour. So yes, plan something, but maybe also get your partner on task with what that plan is as well, or other people are on board as well. Catherine, what can you suggest for people for social, mental, and physical preparation for this defense?
I felt like the Home Depot was going to be part of the celebration. I thought it was going to be like, and we got there and then I'm like, what's
Nope.
going to be? Anyway.
No, he was just picking up insulation.
Well, what says celebration like insulation? Yeah, I totally agree with the celebration. And that's a tip I have for like your whole career. Academics is a lot of negative feedback and very little positive feedback. So when you get positive feedback, like you get an article accepted, you get a conference presentation accepted, celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. And that's what like evens out the negative positive feedback. I will say I'm a massive over preparer. So like prepare. Because when you prepare, then you feel more comfortable. So back to Jessica's practice questions and all that. Also, I would say you're going to pass. Your advisor wouldn't let you go to the defense if you weren't going to pass, because then they look like a bozo. Because if you have brought your student to the defense and they're not ready, then what were you doing, right? So you are going to pass. So just remember that in your back pocket. And then I would also say, it's okay to be nervous. Everybody's nervous. Everybody was nervous at their own defense. Everybody's nervous before teaching their first class. Everybody's a bit nervous before a conference presentation. Don't look at the room and think no one else is nervous. Well, they're not nervous now because they're just sitting there, but they're all nervous in equivalent situations. And people know you're going to be nervous, and that's just because you're a normal human and you care about this. So just accept your nervousness, harness it, get your little glass of water, take it for a minute to sort of relax and just sort of use that energy. It's all right, because you can't get rid of it. You're not going to sleep, and that's going to be okay. And you're going to be a little tired, and then after you're going to celebrate, and then you're going to sleep like a mad woman, right? And that's all right.
This is a really good point, and I've yet to run into someone else who has defended either a master's or a PhD and not been scared before it and not lost sleep. It happens to all of us. That's just how it goes. If you do manage to sleep the night before, congratulations, that's fantastic. Ride it, just go with it. Don't question it. But if you don't sleep and you are nervous, that's really normal. Jessica, how can others prepare emotionally, socially, physically going in?
So I think one of the things, that tends to happen is people don't eat. And I think that, for some folks, I sat in some defenses that were like hours long, and it's a long time to go without having eaten something. So just being mindful of like, when's the last time you ate? What did you eat? I think can be really helpful to just getting you through it, because you do have to be able to function, to answer questions, to hear questions, to present on your work. To Catherine's point about everyone is nervous, I actually think too that some of the committee members are nervous too. They're nervous about, what's my question going to sound like? Are people going to be able to answer my question? Everybody is nervous. The people who are sitting around the table are nervous. Everyone is nervous. The other thing that I did was to actually, when I was practicing my presentation piece, was to actually put on the clothes that I wanted to wear, to actually see how I would feel in my body in those clothes. And realized now these pants were way too tight. I am not wearing these pants. So I had to change that outfit. So that I think was actually a practical thing that I did to kind of see how I would feel, knowing that I would, because I talk with my hands clearly, that I'd want to have space in my outfit. And then the other thing that I did that was, again, because I'm an over preparer, like Catherine mentioned as well for herself, is that I physically went to the room that the defense was scheduled for, so I knew where it was, trying to also see if I could get in there to see about the tech situation. Could I figure out, because I had someone calling in who was going to figure that piece out. So I didn't want that to be another thing that I had to navigate on top of Did I bring my presentation? Did I bring my water? Did I bring my notes? So those kind of practical things that you can do beforehand might help to mitigate some of the stress or the feelings of nervousness that happen the day of.
I think those are
Particularly in the Zoom world too, like the equivalent of that is like, I did this big presentation a little while ago, and the number of times I called my husband on Zoom and just was like, can you see the slides moving? Can you see it? He's like, I can't see it from the other room. I'm like, okay. And then shut it off, turn it again, blah, blah, blah. Because you realize I've done it on my own computer, but I don't know what it looks like on anyone else's computer. And that's the only reason I had the advice for Nicole, because in fact, I've done it wrong so many times in a row, and you don't want that for yourself on the day of the defense. So practice it in the pants, and with, like, you're totally right about the pants, right? And like with the in the room or on your Zoom or whatever, do it 10 times if that's what it takes to make you feel comfortable, because then you know on the day, I'm not going to not have my technology work or be in some uncomfortable situation.
Yeah. And I think that you also were bringing up a really good point, is that, yeah, we over prepare, but some of us, maybe this is me, but I have a feeling it's other people as well, that us over preparers like to be prepared in other realms of our lives as well. And so going into a defense, there's a lot of stress on you for this performance. Maybe you're not in control of all the other spheres that week as much as you normally were. So if you have a support network, be it a partner or be it family members or friends, or even other grad students, there's a reason they're there. Get them to pick up some of the slack on some of the stuff. It's fair, I think, for you to say to, if you're, well, I taught the semester that I defended. So it's fair to, I think, to say to my TAs being like, hi, I'm going to lecture, but I'm not going to be up on emails all week. So maybe you can help me out with emails from students, or to your family members being like, hey, I know I usually do a lot of this list of stuff around the household. I need you to pick up the slack on this one. I'm going to be MIA. So I think that that's fair, that you, in preparation for yourself, you also have other people that are going to help you out. You're not doing this alone. That's why you also have a committee, but you're not doing this alone, emotionally, physically, and socially as well. Lean on those people. I think that they would be happy to do it as well. I think that we also underestimate how stoked people are when you ask them for help sometimes. So moving along. So now we theoretically have defended our dissertation and everything has gone great because you did all of these great tips. But now we're in the post-defense stage where you maybe have some revisions and you undoubtedly have some paperwork to do. How can we get through some of those challenges so we've reached the final goal where everything is submitted clean, good to go? So Casey, what do you have in terms of tips?
It's a good question. I mean, staying up on the process of how and when the paperwork needs to be submitted and things of that nature, because it can, and I remember this actually almost being the case for myself with my defense being in September. And I remember things had to be submitted by a certain date or I would be paying tuition for the next semester. And it was tight. And I had to actually really, I had to talk with School of Graduate Studies, with my supervisor, to expedite the process of that paperwork, where it was, at least from what I can tell, an instance where, like, if it's not in, you're just paying. Sorry, so you might want to do some research into those sorts of hard deadlines at a more institutional level, to make sure that everything is, submitted on time. And to the extent that you can try to follow that paper trail to make sure that it's moving through the right hands and everything. In terms of revisions, I mean, I would just treat it like, the final round of making sure that your bases are covered and that you're attending to requests that you deem to be reasonable and generative for the findings and claims that you're making. I can't speak to, I don't recall doing revisions on my dissertation, but I imagine that you have some flexibility, just like in a journal article, if you've written those already or plan to write them, to incorporate things that really help your dissertation, and to maybe not incorporate ones that you still think like it really doesn't fit, or it actually is making my framework more diluted and less streamlined. But that's just my general sense. I can't speak from the other side of being on a committee and what those expectations are. Maybe one of our other panelists can, but that's what comes to mind for me.
Thanks. No, but that's really helpful. Some of those deadlines that the universities set in terms of graduation date or having papers in don't always align with what you've set for your defense date. So you might not realize that your defense date has come right up close to one of those paper deadlines or paperwork deadlines, and you have to really crank out those revisions so that you're not, like Casey's saying, paying an extra round of tuition, which is not fun. Catherine, what about you? What do you think they can do?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, because I think, the dissertation is a marathon. So you've been like running this amazing marathon, and then you get to the end, which is the defense, and you're so happy. And then we say, oh, if you could just do one tiny little sprint now, like that would be great. And you're thinking like, you've got to be kidding me. I just did this marathon and I made it through like a champion, right? So that is in some ways, a hard part. Even if you just have little things to do, you're like kind of a little bit over it and into the champagne period of the time, right? So what I would say is, I would suggest you meet with your advisor as soon as possible after the defense and get like a specific list of to-dos. Like what actually has to be done to pass this? And I bet you'll be surprised that your advisor will have less things than you think, because probably they're like, well, it was mostly good, but here's like 2 factual things. And then like, could you add a paragraph about X? Okay. So it's probably going to be less than you think, but in any event, you want to know it's not like everything talked about at the defense, it's some smaller subset of that. So what actually is it? Clarify if the dissertation has to go back to just your advisor or the committee. Is it your advisor who's just going to check it off, or is it going back to everyone in the world, right? Probably it's just your advisor. So that matters too. And then the last thing I would say is just do it. Don't linger, don't take time off, don't go away. You don't want to do the sprint, totally get it. But the longer you wait, the harder it is to do it, because you kind of forgot what you were going to do and you got to like get back into the mind space. It's like, just get in there, do it, and move on.
That's a really good point. And a lot of the times the revisions that you'll get for your dissertation aren't large revisions. You shouldn't be getting really large revisions at that point. And so the sitting down and doing them probably won't take too long. So it's may as well get it off your plate while you can. Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, and I'll agree. And then unfortunately, folks, I will have to go. I have a sick toddler here I can just hear her crying in the background. So I'll have to go after this. But I echo both what Catherine and Casey mentioned there. I think that I was someone who did have some revisions to do. So definitely meeting with my supervisor, kind of figuring out a game plan for that, but actually treating it like a journal kind of revision type of thing of I don't have to say yes to everything. I just have to kind of pick and choose what makes sense for the piece of scholarship that I have produced, and then go from there. I did take, I think it was like 2 days where I ate and I slept, and then became another human being again, and then tackled the revisions, did it very quickly. So I think within the week it was done, and that was it. And there wasn't like another round of having to do anything else. It was like one and done, which was quite different than the rest of the dissertation process, where in my mind, I thought at the proposal stage, I just propose something and I can just carry on. And that was not, I learned that lesson real quick. Same with when I was writing my chapters in my dissertation. I thought, great, I finished it, now we're done. And that was not how it worked. But at the end, that is how it worked. I kind of took in the feedback, had that conversation with my supervisor, and then it was done. And I think for me, I felt that at the end of the defense, there was going to be like fireworks and there's going to be confetti, and there was nothing. There was none of that. And even when I resubmitted the final draft, there was none of that. So you really have to do that like for yourself. I think Catherine had mentioned that you have to celebrate that for yourself, because it's a huge feat that you've come to the end of this entire process. So that's kind of what I did. And I don't know if you folks can also see the Q&A, the little bubbles that pop up there. There's a really interesting question about how to get the dissertation done in the first place so that you can arrive to this defense spot. So I don't know if you're going to get to those, but maybe I'll just throw in one thing that I would suggest. So I had a really hard time trying to carve out space to write. And I had to kind of figure out the time of day that worked for me. And then I stuck to it. So every day it was in the morning and I would just write. And being the kind of person who I am, who has to like formulate perfect sentences in my head before I write them down, I had to throw that out the window and just write. Didn't matter what it was, I just wrote. And that became a bit of a habit for me, became like a job of like, no one talked to me between the hours of 9 and 12, I am writing, I am working. And that was really, really helpful to getting it actually done to meet those deadlines that Casey mentioned. So I don't know if you're able to share my email with folks, but if folks do have other questions and they want to ask me specifically, feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer your questions. And it was great to see Catherine and Casey and Nicole. And I'll tune out for now, but good luck everybody with whatever stage you're at. And don't forget to celebrate.
And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Jessica Braimoh. We really appreciate you giving your time and hope you have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye. I think that Dr. Jessica Braimoh gave some really good points that try and get the revisions done quickly. You have agency over them, but as she said, doing a defense is the marathon, and at the end of a marathon, you do need to hydrate and sleep. So take a couple days to do those and then turn around and get those revisions done quick so that you're not paying any more tuition. So we've talked a lot about defense, and in the Q&A, we are going to talk a little bit more about writing your dissertation, and I'm so appreciative of Jessica giving those comments. But to just wrap up this conversation on preparing for your defense, what is one thing that you wish someone had told you before your defense? I know we all have those little nuggets and those moments after where we're like, oh, darn, if I had known that, this would have happened. So Catherine, what is the one thing that you wish somebody told you before your defense?
I wish that they told me that there wasn't a right answer to every question, because I feel like there was definitely at least one where I was like, what's the right answer? I'm like, is it this? And then like looking at people like, are you gonna wink if it's the right answer? And like no one winks. So I'm like, well, is it this? And I just allowed myself to meander around. And I think it really, I wasn't assertive enough. I should have just said, interesting question, this is my answer. And if they wanted to come back and follow up, that was their prerogative. I don't even think they wanted to. So I had given too much weight to a question that wasn't even that central. And then I allowed it to become a bit of a bee in my bonnet. And I think that if I could tell myself now, all people want you to do is to engage with their thoughts, engage with their questions, provide a reasonable answer to that. And that's what I would have told myself.
I think that's excellent advice, and I completely agree with it. Casey, what do you wish someone had told you before your defense?
On the surface, this might sound counterintuitive, but I think it connects to a lot of the other things that I've mentioned. And that is, I wish someone told me to prepare more by looking forwards than looking backwards at dissertation research, because based on my own defense and some of the others that I've seen, a lot of the questions are going to be more about what is the impact of your contribution to knowledge? How might it be applied or extended by other scholars? What does it give to sociology as a discipline? How can you transfer that knowledge to groups or stakeholders who are not sociologists or not in academia, and the like? And I think that if you concentrate a good portion of your preparation towards thinking forwards about how your own research created new opportunities for you, both intellectually and practically in terms of what you plan to do after graduating from the PhD program, or even just how it has opened new avenues for research. I think that that's actually incredibly generative for a discussion that's both grounded in what you did, which is already really salient in your head. I don't think that you've done that marathon. You don't have to try to sprint through it again in preparation. So thinking more about all of those future directions, both for yourself and for your work as an intellectual product, and how others, both within and outside of the university, might use it or think about it, is something that I would use as a main guideline for the defense preparation.
That's a really good point. And every defense that I've seen, and mine own included, there have been questions about where does the research go from here? Or what do you plan to do with this research going forward? And that's a really exciting question to get to answer at this point in your career, that, oh yeah, all this work that I've done has a meaningful impact, and how well will it go forward? It's a really lovely thought experiment at the very least for you to do when you're finishing up your dissertation. But you're probably going to be asked this. So it's nice to start thinking about, oh, well, where does my life lead after this? And how does this research fit into it? It's a really good point. So thank you all for taking my questions and answering them and giving such thoughtful feedback to them all. We're now going to switch to questions from the audience. So audience members, if you have absolutely any questions about preparing for the defense, or if there's any challenges you're experiencing as a PhD student moving forward in your dissertation about some challenges that you might be experiencing, we're happy to field those. So go ahead and put them in the chat box that is available through the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So I'll just start off. Jessica started with one of the questions that's already in here. So she said, you focused a lot on the defense itself today and less on getting the dissertation done. I'm wondering what tips you have for those of us who are still at various stages of writing. Getting through writing your dissertation can be a slog sometimes. And Jessica mentioned that for her, it was about carving out time and finding a specific time in the day that works best for her. Casey and Catherine, what advice can you give PhDs who are going through that process of writing right now? Oh, Catherine, go first.
Yeah, so I think so there used to be a television show called Survivor. And on Survivor, they had like all sorts of challenges. So you have to like survive on this island, et cetera, et cetera. So like eat gross bugs or like, pardon me?
It's still on.
Still on?
Yeah.
Anyways, okay. So you like eat gross bugs, or you do like a physical challenge or a mental challenge. And I always feel like the PhD is like the challenge on Survivor, where like everyone has to hold on to a pole, and whoever can hold on to the pole longest wins, right? So there's a moment, it's not about like intelligent, like everyone's smart, like you got into grad school, so you're very smart, you have good writing skills, you're all these great things. But there's a moment where you're holding onto the pole and you're thinking like, why am I holding onto this pole still? I just can't do it anymore. And you just have to keep holding onto the pole. And there's like, that's the thing about the dissertation, is that there's a moment where you're like, I'm tired of this. I've been working on this a long time. I need to just sort of keep pushing myself to keep going. And that's, I think, the mental challenge of the dissertation. It's not that people aren't smart enough to do it. Of course they are. It's that sort of commitment and perseverance. So what I would say is that what I find personally helpful is a strategy of slow and steady wins the race. So my two favorite books about this are a book called Advice for New Faculty Members by a guy named Voice. It's great for grad students too. And then a book called How to Write a Lot, which is like, anyways, by a psychologist, and exactly what it sounds like. And all of their advice is exactly the same, slow and steady. Nobody can write for 12 hours a day. People that tell you that they're working 80 hours a week are not working 80 hours a week, because it's not actually possible for a human brain to work 80 hours a week writing. It's not. So maybe they're sitting in front of their computer for 80 hours a week, but nobody can write for 80 hours a week. So it's better, just like Jessica said, to every day from 9 to 12, I write. And then maybe Nicole goes for a run. I don't go for a run, but maybe I read my novel for a little bit, right? And have lunch. And then you work on teaching in the afternoon and you do something else, blah, blah. And then the next morning, what do I do from 9 to 12? I write. And I don't feel anxious about writing because I know that every day I'm going to write. So I write what I write today. And when the day's done, I've done what I've done, but I know that tomorrow I'm coming back and I'm going to write again. So you don't have these spurts and then exhaustion. You just have slow and steady wins the race. I never work at night. I've never worked after 6 p.m. in my entire life. I would never get anything done. I never work on the weekend, ever, because I want to be refreshed on Monday. Now, maybe some people are desperate night people. My husband actually, if he had his way, worked from like 10 to 2 o'clock in the morning every night, which we can't because we have kids. But the point is, maybe you have a different schedule, but nobody's schedule is effectively working 80 hours a week. So just know, pick your time, slow and steady wins the race. Every day you do that, then you do something else. Then the next day you do that again, blah, blah, blah. And that is what's going to get you to finish your dissertation, make progress, feel satisfied with that progress, but also not just burn out and then think like, I hate this whole thing. And so that would be my advice.
I completely agree with Catherine. The way that I got through was I'm a morning person and I wrote in the mornings, but I can't sit in front of a computer for extended periods of times. So in the afternoon, that's when I taught. For me, teaching is a good shift and it gets me out of that writing brain. That might not be the same for everyone. I know that teaching can be really stressful for some people. So maybe in the afternoon, that's when you're doing community work or you're doing some other aspect of your sociological work. For me, teaching was great. But like Catherine says, breaking up the day brings you back to refreshed when you get to sit down and write. Casey, what do you think?
Yeah, not to turn all of this on its head so far, because it's actually similar in some ways. And I think what I'm going to describe just speaks to a different way of de-romanticizing the writing process, which I think is really important. And obviously for some people, having that time that's blocked off, or that it's going to be low pressure, but I'm going to write every day, that could be really helpful. For me, it's sort of when the thought or idea is there, I just write it down no matter what. And I actually ended up writing a pretty large amount of my dissertation on my phone. Obviously, it had to be polished, but I think that you should, to the extent that you can, try and lean into writing those ideas whenever you have them. And even if it's not within your scheduled writing block, if it's like on your 15-minute break between lecturing or TAing, but you thought of something, try to get it down on paper. And then you'll eventually realize, at least in my case, I realized that I had some major sections of my dissertation fleshed out in the notes application on my phone. And that was kind of a product of just realizing that I don't always have to be doing okay, I'm going to sit down, I have my coffee and water, and I'm in my creative space. Obviously, that's ideal for many people, but if you can couple that with doing really informal writing that's still, at the peak of the light bulb going off, I think that can be really crucial. The other one too, which has worked for some of my colleagues, and is more, opportunity based, but doing some sort of writing retreat where you actually it's not like a self-imposed schedule, but you're able to break away from all of the distractions or most of the distractions that go on in daily life. And so if you have, a particular weekend that you can block off, or potentially longer, you could try to use that for uninterrupted writing time, with probably taking the same sort of perspective in that it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to finish the dissertation while you're on that retreat, but allowing yourself to be less drawn towards, checking social media every 15 minutes or, going out to the grocery store, because we obviously all have to do that. But by putting a concrete block of time aside like that for a retreat could be productive for getting writing finished.
I think you make a really important point too, that getting an idea down when you have it is really important, because sometimes those things can be fleeting and you might lose it, and you might just lose it for good. But also, I don't know how many of you also have the experience of you're sitting down, you're like, okay, this is morning time, this is when I write, and then you're like, well, the writing's not coming. So it's those moments where, like Jessica was saying, is this isn't going to be perfect writing. We're just going to get it out. But also for me, changing where I wrote sometimes was really important. So I often wrote from my office, but sometimes I was just so tired of being in there. So I'd take my laptop to the library, I'd take it elsewhere. And sometimes it sounds really silly, but just that change of environment can really spark you to pick up different ideas or different motivations. So yeah, it's good to have routines and it's good to find different things that are working, but sometimes you do have to just change it up and try different strategies, and that might actually work for you. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to move on to another question from the audience. This is from Emma, and she says, I often find it hard to give an elevator pitch when friends and others ask what you are studying. I think it's a symptom of a bigger issue. It's important to winnow down, prioritize, clarify my writing, but it's so hard. Any tips? Ooh, that's a elevator pitch is difficult. Casey, do you have any ideas for students who are trying to give an elevator pitch when people ask about their research?
I try to dilute down as much as I can, both verbally and in writing, to the most simplistic language that I can use to get across. And I think in many cases, if it's not an academic audience, like in an elevator pitch or talking to family, I think it tends to be more about like not what particular concept or theory you're developing or extending, but what's the core sociological issue that you're interested in? Perhaps in trying to crystallize that, it's thinking more about the why of your project rather than the what. And then in answering why what you're doing is important to you and interesting, those whats can sort of be marbled in to answer that question. Maybe I'm not being very clear in my language, but I do think that in trying to transfer knowledge about what I'm doing in that way, it's just trying to be like being as clear to the point of what you're doing, why it's important. In my case, it's like, I want to know if fathers feel pressured to live up to expectations of masculinity. And does that make them feel lousy, or does it make them feel protected in the sense that, they're fulfilling a provider role in the family? And I think that if you think about what you're doing and putting it into terms that, an adolescent would understand, you can try and use that for talking to other people about what you do, why it's important, and other stuff of that nature.
I think that's great. And I think you just gave a fantastic elevator pitch. I want to know more. And I think that that's what is key in a good elevator pitch is you give sort of this tertiary information. You're not delving deep because eyes will glaze over. But you're giving them points of maybe they want to pick at that and ask you more. This might work for some people and might not work for everyone. I have gone by either I sort of give, well, I study education and inequality, and I think about like these broad things that my family members would sum up my research with. So I've sat back when my family tries to describe the work that I do, be it my partner or my parents. And sometimes it's a great way to be like, oh yeah, that is a really broad way of saying it. Except for my father, who one time let in with, oh, she studies psychology. And you're like, nope, don't do that. So think about also how other people describe your work is sometimes a good way to step back and be able to see the bigger picture. Catherine, how do you go about thinking about an elevator pitch?
Yeah, I think elevator pitches are actually super hard, and they're sold like they're like the easy way of talking about it, but it's easier to make simple things complicated than to make complicated things simple. So it's very hard. So it's a totally legitimate question, Emma. I totally agree with Nicole's point about think about how you would explain it to your mom or your roommate. Smart people that are just regular people out in the world that don't know anything about sociology. And that's how you should explain it to a sociologist, because the fact of the matter is that most sociologists aren't in your area. So you should explain it at that more general level. I often think it's helpful to think about why you have your original interest in that. because that might be partly why other people have their original interest in that, right? I also think, frankly, Casey's elevator pitch was fantastic. And partly it's good because it clicks into something that regular people have already thought about, but don't necessarily know they've thought about, right? So you're bringing it back to someone's regular experience. I would also say that, so for me, I study social movements. And so what I always used to say is, when we think about activists, I study what happens to activists over time. And we think about activists and we think, you either become an activist at university and you're like a diehard activist forever, or you get involved for a little bit and then you kind of die out. But actually, it turns out that most people are somewhere in the middle. They tend to move in and out of activism over time. And why does that happen? That's it, right? So it's following the same model of sort of, we study X, but what about Y? Or we tend to think X, but what about if it's actually Y, right? So Casey's is kind of the same, right? So it's like the idea of like fatherhood. So in a way, like we think about motherhood in this way, but kind of what about fathers? He doesn't say it like that at all, but it's like you're sort of bringing this idea of a general way of thinking and then a challenge to that. And that's the hook that gets people in. And then you say, blah, blah, blah. Like when people say, that's fascinating, then you get into all the crazy details. But I think that because academics are so specific, we have a fear of overgeneralizing, and we want everyone to know all the crazy details, but you are trying to lure them in. So go with the crazy general, and they want to talk details. I talk details all day, right? Who do you study? How do you do it? Blah, blah, blah. Great, right? Because now you sucked them in. So don't be afraid to be overgeneral, like your mom would, or your family, or your friends, as they describe your work.
And I completely agree. I think our biggest fear is that somebody is going to misquote us or say, oh, we do this, like my dad. And you just, then you have those moments where you're like, nope, we're just gonna reel it back in. Catherine, before we get on to the next question, one of our attendees has asked if you could write down the books that you mentioned. Could you just put that into the chat at the side? Yeah. Awesome, thank you. And one more question. Do you have any more tips for balancing other responsibilities with your work on the dissertation, given that it's such a long process, thinking about family or jobs, etc.? So I'll go to Casey first. Balancing other responsibilities can be really challenging. Thinking about a lot of us at a certain stage in our lives where we have family, we have to also bring in an income that might be a little bit more than what we're getting from the university. So how do you balance all these responsibilities and get your dissertation done?
I'm probably not the best person to ask this as someone who doesn't have kids, and I didn't work on the side of my PhD program and stuff like that. So I'm not sure about my advice for having to balance a lot of other responsibilities. What was really valuable for me is actually having some sort of creative outlet, which isn't a responsibility, but it's almost like a bit of a remedy from the responsibilities. So, obviously having to take on the demands of work and school, and in many cases, parenthood as well, will greatly press your time and can be very stressful. But one way that I at least try to counteract a lot of those responsibilities and stressors is to have some sort of hobby or creative outlet that is completely divorced from academia. Like, it shouldn't be like, oh, well, my hobby is doing book reviews for the Sociological Review or something like that. Like, I think that having something that's completely disconnected from your academic life that brings you joy or fulfillment can be really important, especially in those final stages of completing the dissertation.
And I agree with that. I think that it's really important for PhDs. Sometimes the work we're doing in our family life gives us more dimension to who we are, but also we need to have time as well outside, and having hobbies is really important for that. Like I said previously, I run and I cycle, but part of doing a PhD and being in academia is you're going to receive a lot of critiques, and your self-value and your self-worth can't be completely tied to what you're producing in academia. You have to have something else. So this isn't necessarily time balancing, but I think that this is emotional and protecting of yourself. Is when you're going through this process, it's really healthy to have some other outlet that identifies you or that you identify with that you're putting your time in as well. That will help you in writing, and that will help you in getting things done, because if when you're writing you get some negative feedback and that just tanks you and bottoms you out, you're not going to be very productive. You need those other things that you're like, oh man, that was some crummy feedback. I'm just going to go take a minute over here and do these things that I'm really great at, and then I'm going to come back and address this one. You need to have those moments. Catherine, how you balance time getting things done?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And you know, when I was a PhD student, doing my dissertation, I didn't have a family. I have a family. I didn't have children, I should say, or a partner. So I think that things change over time with that. But honestly, in some ways, I think having kids and a partner is a wonderful way to force you away, right? Because otherwise, sometimes what happens is you can just work and work and work and work, and there's no one to tell you. But I'll tell you, my 7-year-old son, he's like, doesn't care about this work at all. He's like, Mom is a teacher. That's sort of interesting. Like, will you play Pokemon with me right now for 17 hours, right? So I think in a way that's good, right? Because at the end of the day, am I going to say, I wish I had one more article, or am I going to say, I wish I played Pokemon with my son more? Probably the Pokemon. And whatever it is for you, maybe it's not, maybe you don't have kids, maybe you got a dog, or you love to run, or you have parents, or you have friends, you have a partner, you have whatever. And I think that, you know, we are told this trick, this lie, that if you're not working 80 hours a week, you don't care about this job. Well, that is a lie. That is not true. And if you want to be the best you can be at this, then you have to be a person, right? That has friends and has family and sleeps sometimes and exercises and reads novels and does pottery or whatever, right? And I think that that's, you don't have to make excuses about that. That doesn't mean that you take this less seriously or you're less into that. It means that you're an actual human, and that's good. And that means on Monday, when you come back to this, you're going to be better at it, and you're going to get more done in your 3 hours than the person who spent their whole weekend staring at their computer screen, getting all sucked out. And then they're on Monday, they're all little shelves of themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so you're better off. You're actually more productive doing it that way.
And I'd like to also speak to some students like myself. I was a research assistant and I taught for all of my PhD. So I was either multiple TA, or when I finally became a candidate, I was an instructor. So I taught courses. And for me, part of that is money. I needed to support my lifestyle in this really expensive city that I live in. I live in Vancouver. So yeah, it's hard balancing the expectations of the department. Sometimes when the department's like, you need to finish on time and you need to have all these publications, and you're like, yeah, but I need to eat too. And also there are things in academia that you might really value that maybe other people in your academic sphere don't value as heavily. Teaching might be one of those. For me in my career, I highly value teaching, and I think that this is something that I want to do moving forward in some capacity. So if these are things, professional things that are important to you, just like writing time, you're carving out time for yourself in those things as well. You'll get things done. It's just going to be maybe a little bit different from other people, but you're still getting it done. So I think that actually sums us up for all of the questions, unless there aren't any other lingering questions from our audience. It doesn't look like there are. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists for giving up time today and for struggling with me through the beginning of this seminar and helping me with the slides is greatly appreciated, Catherine. And I'd like to thank all of our audience members for taking part and providing us with such thoughtful questions. It's really appreciated. If you would like to learn anything more about the Canadian Sociological Association Student Concerns Subcommittee, you can find this recording, although the front end might be cut out, but that on our website, and you can find previous webinars that are chock full of helpful tips and tricks for getting through other aspects of academic life. So thank you all for joining. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the conference and a great week. Thank you all.
Thanks, Nicole. Wonderful session.
Bye. Thank you.